As the 21st century began, Marvel Comics was reinventing itself. It had climbed out of its financial ruin by the mid-90s with big-budget hit movies based on its characters like Blade in 1998 and X-Men in 2000. Marvel was finding more success outside of comics publishing as a license-generating engine, pushing its properties into other media like television, film, and video games with renewed focus. As the company prepared for the cinematic debut of Spider-Man in 2002, a film that had been in development hell for nearly 25 years, it was time to bring the wall crawler back to the spotlight. It's fitting then that Sony, whose Sony Pictures subsidiary, would finally put him on the big screen and would be instrumental in staging the character's triumphant return to the world of gaming. Spider-Man hadn't started his own game since 1996's forgettable adventure for Sega's 32X, Web of Fire. By 1999, Activision had gotten the license from Marvel and tapped its internal studio, Neversoft, to develop a new game for Sony's PlayStation console, which was nearing the end of its life cycle. Neversoft had comics in its DNA. The studio was founded at the height of the comics boom in 1994 by former programmers of Malibu Interactive, the video game division of Malibu Comics. Malibu was eventually acquired by none other than Marvel, but not before Chris Ward, Joel Jewett, and Mick West could form their independent development studio, which itself was bought by Activision in 1999. In fact, in 1996, the company worked for 6 months on a game based on another Marvel character, Ghost Rider, for Crystal Dynamics. That wound up canceled. It might have been Neversoft's destiny to work on a game for Marvel's flagship character, or maybe getting the Spider-Man assignment from Activision was just another in a string of marvelous coincidences. Whatever the case, for Neversoft to fully master the ways of the spider, first it needed to get some help from a different animal, the Hawk. The studio's in-house game engine had been evolving since 1996 when it was created for a game called Big Guns that never saw release. In 1998, Neversoft used the engine in a game called Apocalypse, which didn't tear up the charts despite featuring the voice talents of Bruce Willis. But while Willis couldn't sell gamers on Apocalypse, he could sell Tony Hawk on Neversoft. Activision assigned the studio the task of making a skateboarding game, so the studio rewrote the Apocalypse engine's physics and controls. Skateboarding legend Tony Hawk had been visiting different companies about licensing his likeness for a video game. And when he met with Neversoft, Hawk ended up face-to-face with a digital Bruce. Said studio co-founder Joel Jewett in 2004, the first demo, the one we showed to Tony Hawk to get him on board, had Bruce Willis on a skateboard. He was still holding a gun, I think. Even with Bruce packing heat, Hawk was impressed with what he saw, and Activision and Neversoft scored the license. The game that followed, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, birthed one of the industry's most successful game franchises. Shortly after securing the Tony Hawk license, Activision gave Spider-Man to Neversoft as well. Luckily for the developer, their newly revamped game engine was made specifically to showcase characters performing death-defying acts of acrobatic audacity. Tony Hawk and Spider-Man were a match made in heaven. In 2000, Activision published Spider-Man for the PlayStation. For the first time, players controlled Spidey in a three-dimensional environment, zipping from floor to ceiling fluidly, beating up on bad guys left and right, and crawling around with intuitive controls. If Spider-Man could do it, chances are players could too. The fact that it featured top-notch vocal talent culled from Spider-Man's animated adventures in the late 90s didn't hurt, nor did its compelling original story. The wealth of comic book minutiae like alternate costumes, a what-if mode, and narration from Spider-Man creator Stan Lee was all just icing on the cake. From top to bottom, Spider-Man was a revelation, taking full advantage of this powerful generation of gaming hardware to do something sensational. It was a smash. At the time, reviewers hailed it as the best Spider-Man game, but for many fans, it might have even been the best superhero game, period. Over the next year, Activision seized on the game's tremendous popularity. They tapped their other in-house studios, Edge of Reality, Treyarch, and Vicarious Visions, to make ports for the Nintendo 64, Sega Dreamcast, and Game Boy Color respectively to satisfy demand for the webhead. In 2001, Vicarious Visions developed a sequel, Spider-Man 2: Enter Electro, which didn't fare nearly as well as its predecessor. Critics slammed it for buggy controls and camera problems, and Activision didn't bother porting it to any other systems. It didn't matter. Enter Electro's failure was quickly forgotten in the wake of the enormous success of Spider-Man's film debut in 2002. The movie earned $821 million in worldwide box office that year. Suddenly, Spider-Man wasn't simply a popular character, he was a pop culture phenomenon. Since Neversoft was too busy printing money with Tony Hawk sequels for Activision, the publisher assigned the video game tie-in to Treyarch. This new Spider-Man hit the next generation of systems, Sony's PlayStation 2, Microsoft's Xbox, and Nintendo's GameCube, and took full advantage of the greater graphical horsepower those consoles offered. As for gameplay, Treyarch knew better than to mess with success. The studio took most of the gameplay elements from Neversoft's original PlayStation title and simply added content from the movie, including voice work from Tobey Maguire and Willem Dafoe. But they didn't stop there. The game also featured aerial combat sequences in which Spider-Man swung through Manhattan's skyline and chased villains like the Vulture and Green Goblin. Of course, swinging too low meant death, but even that wouldn't be a problem for long. In 2004, Sony Pictures released Spider-Man 2, another blockbuster hit. Many fans thought it had surpassed the original, and just as the movie's sequel improved on the original, Activision and Treyarch's adaptation took everything that made the last game great and made it simply amazing. Spider-Man 2 offered gamers an authentic digital recreation of Manhattan, setting the superhero loose in an open world unparalleled in size and scope. Even more spectacular, for the first time, Spider-Man could descend to street level to fight thugs or web-sling his way through New York's skyscrapers. The very act of swinging got a major overhaul too. In past games, Spidey's web simply shot up into the air when he swung. In this new title, though, gamers had to actually hit buildings with each hand's web shooter. The realistic take on Spider-Man's powers and world blew fans away, and the sequel quickly took on mythic status among gamers. It was even listed in a 2010 book, 1001 Video Games You Must Play Before You Die. Pretty high praise for a game based on a comic book character. The brand seemed unstoppable, and a year later in 2005, Activision and Treyarch released Ultimate Spider-Man, a game based on the Ultimate line of comics published by Marvel. The game shared the open-world Manhattan environment and web-slinging gameplay of Spider-Man 2, but featured a cel-shaded visual style. The game was a critical success, but spawned no sequels. Now that Spider-Man had reached such lofty heights as multimedia icon, there was really nowhere left to go but down. Spider-Man 3, based on the 2007 sequel of the same name, was released for the next iteration of consoles, Sony's PlayStation 3, Microsoft's Xbox 360, and the Nintendo Wii. But even though the game was on more powerful hardware, it underwhelmed critics for being too similar to the previous one. And despite the movie franchise's hiatus after the third film, Activision knew they had a guaranteed moneymaker on their hands. New games featuring the character, some fun, some forgettable, kept coming. In 2007, Activision published Spider-Man Friend or Foe, a kid-friendly adaptation of the movie trilogy developed by Next Level Games. It was built on the premise of Spider-Man teaming up with his villainous rogues gallery in a side-scrolling beat-em-up game. The game earned mixed reviews. In 2008, Treyarch developed Spider-Man Web of Shadows, which featured a brand new story. Web of Shadows offered players the choice between taking an altruistic path, symbolized by Spidey's classic red and blue uniform, or that of the anti-hero, represented in the game by the black symbiote suit. As players progressed, different powers and new areas of the open-world environment were revealed to them. But despite its unique premise and Metroid-like progression, critics pounced on its lack of polish, poor camera, and graphical glitches. It would be Treyarch's final Spider-Man game. After a 2-year break, Activision published Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions in 2010, developed by in-house studio Beenox. The studio had previously worked on PC and Mac ports of Activision's games, including a few Spider-Man and Tony Hawk titles. The new game featured a brand new story, 4 different versions of the character based on his many incarnations in the comics, and a voice cast called from the character's many animated series. Instead of the open world gamers adored in 2004, the levels were linear and focused instead on delivering story and action. Critics offered it relatively positive reviews, likely a result of its unique look and having gotten some breathing room since the previous release. Next year, Beenox's Spider-Man Edge of Time featured only 2 Spider-Men instead of 4, who teamed up on a time travel adventure. Even though it offered a solid original story and excellent voice acting, overall the game was a watered-down version of the adventure that had come before it, keeping gameplay and action repetitive. Mixed reviews once again signaled Spidey overload. Finally, in 2012, Sony Pictures released a cinematic reboot called The Amazing Spider-Man, starring Andrew Garfield and directed by Mark Webb. And once again, Beenox developed a video game tie-in, promising to restore the character back to his former glory with an open-world setting and brand new gameplay mechanics. Only time will tell how history treats this latest installment in the character's vast library of games. It's been 50 years since Stan Lee and Steve Ditko first spun their Spider-Man tale in Amazing Fantasy number 15. The character has endured every adversity imaginable: teenage heartache, losing loved ones, supervillain chicanery, and even an army of clones, and has come out swinging every time. No matter what form the wall crawler takes in the future, be it in a comic book, a movie, or a video game, fans probably won't be going anywhere. Chances are, they'll always be trapped in his web.